I'm Kathleen Haggerty, the provost at Northwestern. I'd like to welcome you here today and to thank you for joining us for the final Northwestern Roberta Buffett Institute for Global Affairs Fireside Chat of the academic year. Northwestern's Buffett Fireside Chat series provides a forum for the leading thinkers and global actors of our time to share their insights on pressing global issues. Today's discussion will center on a range of geopolitical issues, including Russia's war on Ukraine, the impact of deindustrialization on democracies, and American politics. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce our esteemed guest, Fiona Hill. Fiona is a senior fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institute and serves as a member of the Council on Foreign Affairs. She's also recently served as the Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Europe and Russia Affairs in the National Security Council from 2017 to 2019. From 2006 to 2009, she served as a National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia in the National Intelligence Council. As an expert on geopolitical and foreign policy issues, Fiona will offer insight into Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine and its implications. She is the author of There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century, which I think is being passed out and signed, and co-author of Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. Prior to joining Brookings, Fiona was the Director of Strategic Planning at the Eurasia Foundation in Washington, D.C. She also held a number of positions directing technical assistance and research projects at the Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, including Associate Director of Strengthening Democratic Institutions Project, Director of the Project on Ethnic Conflict in the former Soviet Union, and coordinator of the Trilateral Study on Japanese, Russian, and US relations. Fiona earned a master's degree in Soviet Studies and a doctorate in history from Harvard University, where she was a Frank Knox Fellow. She also holds a master's degree in Russian and modern history from St. Andrews University in Scotland. Welcome, Fiona. It's an honor to have you here today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I would introduce you too. Oh. I'd also like to introduce Annalise Riles, Associate Provost for Global Affairs here at Northwestern University and Executive Director of Northwestern's Roberta Buffett Institute of Global Affairs, which is dedicated to bringing together scholars from across Northwestern University and around the world to address critical global challenges that cannot be solved from a singular disciplinary or geographic perspective. Northwestern Buffett is also dedicated to fostering connections between researchers and experts from government, industry, nonprofit, and non-governmental organizations worldwide to foster collaborations that contribute to real world impact. Thank you to all who have joined us here in person and online this afternoon. Fiona and Annalise, I know our audience is eager to hear from you, so I will let you take it from here.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. And thank you so much, Fiona, for being here.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for having me.
And thank you all. And also thank you to the many, many folks who are joining us online. So let me just say that we will have time for Q&A. If you're here in person, there will be folks running around. Just raise your hand. There'll be folks running around with a mic. If you are online, please put your questions in the Q&A box in the chat. And those will be shared up with me and we'll get to as many as we can. So let's dig right in. So Fiona, you are, among many things, an expert in Russian history. Give us your insight to begin with about why it is that at this moment, Putin chose to initiate this invasion. Why now?
Well, I think the timing, I'm sure many of you have been watching this very closely and reading all the newspapers. I mean, there are a few technical reasons why now. In part, some of it is operational. I mean, this is a special military operation, still according to Russia, rather than an actual war. And there's a certain timing that if you are going to launch a military operation, you know, getting ahead of the spring when the ground is rather soft, and you know, ahead of actually for Russia, their rollover in their conscription forces. So something about the timing is rather technical. I mean, there's lots of other details and we could get into that if people want to hear more detail. But there's also a larger context that Putin thought his window of opportunity for going into Ukraine was closing because certain things were starting to happen on the ground. I just want to make sure, can everybody hear okay? Yeah. You can't hear very much at the top. Yeah, I thought that it looked like people were having a harder time. So let me move that up. Is that better at the back? No? I can hold it. Should I do the lambs singer holding? Yeah, okay, there we go. There we go. Yeah, I could see some faces and I thought, well, it's not my accent. Maybe they just can't hear. All right, we'll do it this way. They're probably having the same issue for you as well, Annalise. So, so anyway, the question, was why did Putin pick now? And so I started off saying there's some operational issues because of the military operation. But there's also some larger timing. And then I want to get back to the history, because in many respects, this invasion is all about history. Putin is actually fighting for his version of history rather than Ukraine's own version of its own history. But the larger idea that Putin thought a window was going to close is that he's become increasingly obsessed about Ukraine over time. And look, I think all of us have been suffering over the last 2 years because of COVID. We've all, one way or another, found ourselves in isolation and doing things we never thought that we'd do. And Putin, we can see it just in the pictures of him meeting with his colleagues at work. And he's sitting here and they're all way over there at the back. And it's not 6 feet of separation, it's 600 feet of separation. And, clearly he's not interacting with them, and he's in many respects just ruminating on things himself. And I do think that a period of isolation, being cut off from people after 22 years in power, in which you think you're pretty infallible and you've got all of these ideas about who you are and what you want to do, that's had an impact as well. But the other issue, building on his obsession with Ukraine, is that he saw a period of acute weakness in the West. So he made a big miscalculation. So for the part of the United States, which he was hoping this would in effect roll back, and also NATO, which Putin has made it very clear he's not a fan of, and certainly doesn't want to see NATO expand any further, certainly not to Ukraine and Georgia and other former Soviet states. He started to see more NATO exercises with Ukraine. So it looked like Ukraine was going to join NATO, but NATO was planning a lot more military exercises with Ukraine itself. The United States had pulled out of Afghanistan. He knew that we here were fed up with the forever wars, and that there was a period of retrenchment here in the United States. I mean, just like the rest of us, he's got reports about the unpopularity of Biden, and there's an expectation on his part that the politics might change. And I think weirdly, he wanted to get ahead of the midterms and then the 2024 elections here, because he wanted to get everyone's undivided attention. And just a little point on 2024, it's also, he has to get re-elected in 2024. So we'll put that one to one side for now, but just bear in mind that 2024 is not just the US presidential election, but also the Russian presidential election and Ukraine's presidential election. So Putin wanted to get ahead of politics. He also saw that NATO was in trouble after 4 years of the Trump administration and all of the recriminations and fights over NATO budgets. And he knew that there wasn't likely an expansion of NATO, but again, he didn't like this idea of exercises with Ukraine. The European Union was weakened. Britain had just pulled out of the European Union, and Britain and France were having a fight over sausages and fish and all kinds of things, and forgetting that they actually had a mutual defense alliance. So there's all kinds of chaos in the European Union. Poland, another arch enemy of Russia and Putin, Poland, is also at odds with the European Union politically, as was Hungary. So there was a lot of weakness that he saw. And then the other kicker was the retirement of Angela Merkel from being Chancellor of Germany for 12 years. And the prospect of an untested coalition of a variety of German parties and a chancellor that, although might be experienced in politics inside of Germany, as was the case with Olaf Scholz, would not be experienced on the world stage. A whole host of other factors. So basically, from Putin's perspective, this was the moment. So if he really wanted to do something about Ukraine, then he had to act now. I mean, there's some other factors I've thrown out there, but I'll sort of stop there and see, where else you want to take it.
That's great. And so that's really helpful. So now if we think not backwards, but forwards for a minute, you've spoken about this invasion as epoch-making, as something on the order of 9/11 in its significance for the geopolitical order. Can you give us your sense, looking into your crystal ball, about the impact of this nationally and internationally in the short, medium, and long term?
Well, first of all, in many respects, as I mentioned before, Putin is fighting about history. And if you read very carefully what he's written, you'll actually notice that in all of these essays and pronouncements and speeches he makes, he doesn't really mention NATO very much at all. So NATO is a bit of a red herring. What he does mention is the fact that Ukraine belongs to Russia in his mind, and Ukrainians are actually Russians. Now, I'm sure there might be someone here in the audience, given the fact that we're close to Chicago, which has the Ukrainian village, someone here who has some Ukrainian heritage, and you will know Ukrainian history, you know this from Eastern Europe. History is very complex, and you can create myths and instrumentalize and weaponize history in many different ways. And that's just what Putin is doing here. Putin is actually denying Ukraine its own history, its own language, and its own culture, and basically saying that Ukraine is just the borderland of Russia, part of Russia. And of course, Ukraine's name means on the borderland. But Putin is also picking specific dates in history to kind of create an origin story of Russia. And in a way, he is returning to the idea of the Russian Empire. Putin said several years ago that the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. But he didn't mean the Soviet state and communism. He meant the idea of the Russian state, because the Soviet Union was the inheritor of what was left of the Russian Empire after the collapse of the Russian Empire at the beginning of the 20th century. And Putin has lambasted Vladimir Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, led the Bolshevik Revolution, and said that Lenin's biggest mistake was creating an independent Ukrainian republic. It wasn't, of course, independent, but it was a separate Ukrainian republic inside of the Soviet Union in 1922. So in many respects, Putin is creating 100 years war arc, a kind of a return to an original sin committed by Vladimir Lenin, and basically saying that he's trying to take Ukraine off the map. And then he also talks about the fact that even before that, Ukraine didn't really exist as a country, even as a territory. He told George W. Bush in 2008 that Ukraine, part of it was in Eastern Europe and part of it belonged to Russia. And he's continued to repeat that in many of the pronouncements and essays that he's written. And there's an important other element in all of this as well, is that because Putin has been in power for so long, 22 years now, either as president or as prime minister, he and many of the people around him have started to see him as the embodiment of the Russian state. And again, it's the Russian state, not the Soviet state. And just to give people a little vignette, the vast room that Putin frequently meets with people in, the one with the big white table and the parquet floor that you've seen in the pictures, it's about the sort of size of this room. I've been in that room. It's very ornate. But what's interesting is that apart from the parquet floor and all the ornamentation, there are 4 statues. And these 4 statues are all of czars that Putin clearly thinks that are relevant to him in some way. So he sort of sees himself now as the embodiment of a Russian czar. And in fact, many of his advisors say there'd be no Russia today without Vladimir Putin. And he's been thought of as this contemporary czar. So this is all relevant for him because the origin of the Russian state, in his view, is in Ukraine and in Ukrainian lands. And the 4 czars all have something to do with this whole history that he's playing out one way or another. The first one is Peter the Great, of the statue, fairly obvious. Peter the Great was really seen as the first person who consolidated the Russian Empire with a battle against the Swedes in 1709 in Poltava, which is a village in Ukraine. The second Tsar is a Tsarina, Catherine the Great, who was a German princess. I'm sure many of you are familiar with all of this, who then bumped off probably her husband to become empress. So a little bit like Putin, quite ruthless. He's always bumping people off, and he speaks very good German and sort of seems to see himself in some respects as also an heir to Catherine the Great. And Catherine the Great is the ruler of Russia who incorporated all the lands that Putin's fighting over right now. The Crimean Peninsula from the Ottoman Empire, the whole region of Donbass, and this area that Putin and the people around him refer to as New Russia, Novorossiya, which is all the places that are getting bombed into oblivion at this moment. Mariupol, Melitopol, Berdyansk, and also extending down to Odessa. Catherine the Great's the founder of all of those cities. And that's the area where in history the Potemkin villages were built. When Catherine the Great's advisor and lover, Prince Grigory Potemkin, wanted to show the Tsarina that they'd really extended Russian rule into these areas and built up all these villages for a trip that she was making to sort of pretend that it was already populated with people. Sounds a bit like now, where it's going to be taking control of rubble. And then one of the other Tsars is Nicholas I, who was the Tsar who got himself into enormous trouble by trying to extend Russian power throughout the Black Sea, and ended up in the Crimean War with the Ottoman Empire, in other words, Turkey, Great Britain, and France fighting against him. And Nicholas I died during the Crimean War. I'm not saying that Putin's going to die through this variant, but it's very interesting, just as a matter of history, that he picked Nicholas I to be one of those statues in this giant chamber. And Nicholas I is the person who completely overextended and almost lost all of that territory.
So, so when you think about where this will take us going forward, we're already seeing NATO transformed, right? I mean, how are you imagining how this conflict, however it comes out, will reshape the global order?
I think when you're doing something, when you're fighting for history, it makes it very difficult to resolve. So sadly, I don't see any particular endpoint in this, because how would you negotiate history? That's basically what Putin's doing right now. And in fact, the negotiator on behalf of the Russians is the culture minister, Mr. Medninsky. And people thought that that meant that Putin wasn't serious when he sent him, but it means that he's deadly serious about history, because Medninsky is the guy who ghostwrote these essays for Putin on why Ukraine matters so much to Russia. So he's basically sent his ghostwriter, the guy who is working with him on this version of history, to negotiate with the Ukrainians, meaning that he wants to get something out of it that basically bolsters his version of history and his idea of what Russia should be. So this is all about the past, whereas Ukraine's fighting for its own present and future. Now that then sets up some pretty troubling patterns that we could see played out elsewhere. I mean, we know of China, for example. The claim on Taiwan is obviously from the past, also looking back to its own history and the history of being, in China's view, humiliated by European colonial powers back in the 19th century and wanting to reverse that. And there are plenty of other countries in Europe and elsewhere who have fights over history and language and territory. So if Putin basically gets away with this, this is, opening the door for a free-for-all. The other issue, of course, and one that I'm sure all of us are worried about, because I know I am, is this threatening of using nuclear weapons. And once you even talk about it in this way, I mean, what we see here is that Putin has put himself in the same place as Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Great powers don't normally saber rattle over, issues of history or, when they see a setback in this kind of conflict. And during the Soviet period, this actually never happened. Yes, we had missile scares like the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Euro Missile Crisis in the 1980s. But in each of those cases, that was because the West as well, we had also developed a new categories of weapons, and we were basically placing them either in Turkey in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis or in Europe, obviously during the Euro Missile Crisis. There's been nothing of that sort in this case. In fact, it's Russia that's developed a new category of nuclear weapons, hypersonic missiles, and has been bragging about them. And it's Putin that's been making simulated attacks of these weapons, usually here on the United States. The first time when he announced them, he showed a big video on a screen behind him in one of his annual addresses, and it looked like he was bombing Mar-a-Lago and Florida. Let's just say President Trump noticed that one. And then the second time that he's been threatening now, there's been almost like cartoonish depictions in the Russian press of basically missiles being sent around the globe and ending up somewhere here in the Midwest, which actually looks like Ohio, so don't worry too much, here, but just it looks like it's kind of coming around to Cleveland, Ohio on the last one that I saw. Anyway, but the whole point of this is that this is the first time that a Russian or Soviet leader has behaved in this fashion. And that's very destabilizing as well. This is why there's a global implications for all of this. Because if you're another power and you have basically a feud, some kind of territorial or other dispute with a neighbor, the lesson is get a nuclear weapon, either to protect yourself or in fact be able to use more coercive power. So we have to get ahead of that. So that's another of those aspects. And then of course there's the commodity prices and the risk of famine from the, now this is very much in the news every single day because of Ukraine being such a major wheat and grain producer, also cooking oil, sunflower oil and other commodities. And then energy, of course, and the energy crisis that's coming out of this. So there's implications for all of us domestically, higher food prices, higher energy prices coming out of this, the risk of famine. And we know in any conflict scenario that this could basically produce even more domestic unrest. If you look back to 2011, the Arab Spring was triggered off by the rise of grain and bread prices in the Middle East. So, you can very easily play out all of the consequences from this. So this is one of the reasons that this is such a dramatic event. It's not just a contained war. This isn't like any of the previous invasions of Russia, say, in the Soviet Union, of Hungary or the Czechoslovakia back in the 50s and 60s. This is now something with global impact.
So, gosh, you've said so many important things there. Let's dig into the nuclear piece a little bit. So I think that for many of our students, this has been quite terrifying because it's a generation that hasn't personally experienced this threat as live in this way. But of course, you also worked in the Trump administration, and Trump did casually threaten to use nuclear weapons, I believe, once or twice. So is the genie out of the box? Are we in a different era now in which this threat is more, it's more legitimate to make and more real and more viable? Or are these one-off things and we'll go back to the old regime as you described it in the Soviet Union times?
Well, it's interesting. Trump was actually more measured on this than perhaps people would have expected. He actually genuinely believed that nuclear weapons were, basically the most serious existential threat. And he said this repeatedly. It's just it got lost in the mix of all the other things that he said. Let's just say he kind of diverted attention away from the fact that he was actually very serious about this. Some of you will have read the many books about Trump where he was always talking about the fact that he had an uncle from MIT who was a nuclear physicist, and obviously he'd had conversations with him. He'd also referred many times to the fact that he'd had all the briefings on the power of nuclear weapons and was greatly disturbed by the implications of all of this. And he saw actually one of the things that he wanted to achieve in his presidency, and the great tragedy, one of the many tragedies was he made no progress on this, was doing something about Russia, North Korea, Iran, and also China. Now that again sounds counterintuitive because he pulled out of the Iran agreement, but he wanted his own agreement that basically put Iran's ability to get a missile, way out of reach. And with Russia, he pulled out of agreements partly because Russia was violating them, but again because he wanted his own agreement. So that was part of the problem. And then in the case of North Korea, he recognized that Kim Jong-un was actually trying to engage in nuclear blackmail. And he spent a lot of time trying to court Kim himself, although didn't make much progress on a larger nuclear agreement. And on China, he'd only just begun really thinking about it. But with Russia, Trump was actually really startled when Putin first started to make these threats. It wasn't just that there was a simulation of bombing Mar-a-Lago. He actually said, and I heard him say this, real countries don't do that. So what was interesting there was, although he would kind of threaten an arms race, it was more in that conventional 1980s kind of sense of things, of the only way that we get to a nuclear arms negotiation, nuclear arms control, is that we have a significant arsenal ourselves. Now, back in the 1980s, which was the last time that we had a major war scare, it was again about a sort of set-piece placement of missiles in Europe, new categories, SS-20 and Pershing missiles. And that's when I decided to study Russian. So actually, one thing for any students listening, you can do something about all this. You can go and study Russian or study arms control and then try to do something about it. Now, I can't say I've been utterly successful in all of my years of understanding why it is that Russia and the United States and the West have reached this point. I mean, I understand it now, but I can't say that I've found the solution to solve it, but at least I understand it a heck of a lot better than I did, back in 1983, 1984, when we had the last war scare, and I too, and everybody else, perhaps a lot of people here in this room worried about what was going to happen. But the dangerous thing about Putin is that he's acting without any checks and balances. He's an operative coming out of the KGB. If he has an instrument, he wants to use it. He's basically given the okay for assassinations using nuclear isotopes, polonium against Alexander Litvinenko in London, the use of a chemical weapon, a military-grade nerve agent with Novichok against another Russian spy in Salisbury in 2018. And, we've seen all kinds of assassinations and, other use of chemical weapons in Syria, for example, on the Russians' watch. And so you can be pretty sure that he's thinking of ways in which he might be able to do something. So we have to head this off. And we can head this off through diplomacy, because I don't think there's a single other nuclear power apart from Kim Jong-un, and even then he probably doesn't want the competition in nuclear blackmail, who would even contemplate doing something like this at this particular point. And for China, I think that's also of great concern, because China wanted to build up a strategic arsenal of tactical, intermediate and strategic weapons, obviously to put pressure on the neighbours, but not to engage in this kind of who knows where it's going to end kind of behaviour. And this, obviously, what Putin is doing upsets the whole strategic balance. And China was preparing itself to be a kind of player in the old style in the strategic balance, more targeted against the United States. But if Putin is opening up this prospect of anybody being able to use a tactical nuclear weapon and crossing that kind of nuclear threshold, it throws everything off. And so I think we actually have an opportunity to get ahead of it with some pretty intense diplomacy instead of waiting around for him to do something. There's also one recourse that we do have. We have, through various treaties and legal instruments, in fact, the frame to completely cut the Russian economy off if there is a use of a weapon of mass destruction. In fact, we talked about it in government when there was the use of chemical weapons in Syria, because the Russians were implicated in that, but when there was the use of Novichok in Salisbury. And of course, they used Novichok against Alexei Navalny as well, with that bizarre assassination attempt. And we actually do have a legal statute requiring us to cut the Russian economy off completely and to cease all ties with it. So there are other things short of contemplating, what are we going to do in a military response, but other instruments that we can use and that we could bring others on board for.
So just so I understand, you're suggesting that the Chinese could be key players in diplomatic efforts to put some guardrails around the use of the nuclear regime?
Yes, because we, in August, there was supposed to be at the United Nations a review of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So, basically to try to stem the acquisition of nuclear weapons more broadly internationally. And we haven't done a great job at that, because there's been so many more nuclear powers have emerged than since the 1980s, when we were in the standoff with the Soviet Union. But there was a commitment on the part beforehand of Russia on the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. And China's not keen on more countries getting nuclear weapons either. There wasn't any support for Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon, and China was very worried about North Korea. But they have all kinds of other reasons for not going quite so aggressively after North Korea. So I think we have an opportunity there if we craft it carefully and work with other nuclear powers and prominent non-nuclear powers who don't want to see proliferation.
Interesting. So let's talk about multilateral institutions for a minute. So President Zelensky has been chiding the UN, saying that it better prove its worth at this point. How are you seeing the value of multilateral institutions as it's played out in this conflict? And do you think there's any possibility of any reforms of the UN coming out of this?
Well, he's not wrong, is he? I mean, it's pretty evident that the UN is not living up to all of the expectations that we placed on it after World War II. I mean, it was designed to actually head off this very eventuality that we're seeing right now. Of course, we created a critical problem with the composition of the UN Security Council by putting in, the five powers, the permanent five that were nuclear powers, but were also in many respects the kind of the victors of World War II, and entrenching them in the Security Council with very little prospect for change. We made a situation where if one of those powers, and look, there was a lot of opposition to what we did, the United States and Iraq in 2003 as well, that there couldn't be any kind of recourse when you had a major power that was sitting on the Security Council doing something that was against the interests of the larger body of countries, of states in the General Assembly. The UN Secretary General actually does have quite a few called good officers or abilities to do certain things, but also is quite constrained. So what's happening in Ukraine, just like what was happening, previously in other conflicts, is a test. And when you're saying about the prospects for reform, it's hard to see. But at the same time, if you do get coalitions of countries that are stepping up and pushing for this, it is possible. I mean, another organisation, and we actually have Ambassador Ian Kelly here, who was the US rep to that organisation, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, is similarly beset because of Russia's opposition to using that for the purposes it was designed for within Europe. I mean, the OSCE ought to be at the forefront of this conflict, but Russia is exercising a veto over efforts of the OSCE to mediate here. And, similarly, with the European Union, Russia is pretty much opposed to any role by the European Union. And of course, NATO is Putin's bogeyman, the organization that he loves to hate and to rail against. And I do worry that as a result of the conflict, that NATO has been given not just a lease of life, which is important to kind of reinvigorate it, but the old lease of life. Basically going back to the past, the kind of Cold War past in some of the thinking, rather than where NATO was heading, which was trying to, refit itself for new purposes in a much more complex 21st century.
How would you envision the best future for NATO? What would you like to see it become?
Well, I mean, Putin has taken us all back to the past. I mean, he's basically fighting old wars from the Cold War and earlier periods, World War I. It's, in some respects, looks medieval. Certainly, pre-modern in many of the things that we're seeing there. It's almost back into antiquity in many respects. The way that the seizure of grain, the reducing of cities to waste. It sounds like, Carthage, the Roman Empire, or back to Babylon. I mean, if you go back into, reading ancient history, every army that came through raped, pillaged, and sacked cities and stole the grain and created famine. So Vladimir Putin's doing a great job of, emulating past conquerors. And NATO obviously was set up as mutual defense against the Soviet Union. And Putin's put us, right back there again as well, of the current rallying of NATO being focused on Russia. When NATO, since 2010, had been undergoing a series of reassessments, trying to deal with the 21st century realities of climate change and the security implications that might come for this. Pandemic, NATO wasn't, particularly equipped to deal with that at the beginning, but has been trying to figure out a role to play as well. Migration, the whole issues of displacement of peoples from regional conflicts, but also climate change, sub-Saharan Africa and around the Mediterranean. And then also the question about China. And this is, of course, why China has jumped into the fray here too, that NATO was also starting to consider an approach to China and how to factor China into security frame. And there's probably no coincidence that it was just after NATO released its thinking on China that President Xi and President Putin had the big statement about a new strategic partnership without limits, and China was very critical about NATO, although I have to say that I was quite shocked that Xi decided to go that far, because up until that point, China had been much more focused on the economic as well as kind of the political influence within Europe, but hadn't really been a security player. I suppose China might say, well, NATO made itself a security player in the Asia Pacific, and so it was just reciprocating. But this, makes things much more complex. But the whole point is that, NATO was going to have to contend with a different century and a different set of challenges. And what we're seeing right now is much more of a discussion, at least on the superficial, the surface level, of the same kind of challenges of the past, of the challenge of Russia.
So on the positive side, one of the interesting developments of this invasion has been the remarkable degree of collaboration we've seen between the private sector and government, and the tech companies, the social media groups, the human rights organizations, the NGOs, the universities. Has this surprised you, and what lessons do you take from that for thinking about how to manage geopolitics going forward?
Yeah, look, and you missed out an element: people power. I mean, this is actually what Ukraine's all about, is people. I mean, every day when you pick up the press and read the human interest stories, you read about a 16-year-old kid who, is a volunteer in somewhere like Lviv, or even in exile in Poland, trying to help the next wave of refugees coming off a train, and trying to basically help them find their way. You hear about all of the women who were, because most of the refugees right now, I mean, the millions of people who have been displaced, mostly women and children and the elderly, basically trying to create protective body armor and other equipment for the Ukrainian soldiers, but others just basically trying to do anything, volunteering in any capacity to try to deal with this. And plus individuals, I'm sure there's lots of people here have been trying to think about what they can do for Ukraine. Many people taking in Ukrainian refugees in Europe, doing something, for the effort. And I think that that's really been very surprising in some respects, just about the scale of it. Reminiscent actually in some respects of, previous conflicts and things that we saw during World War II, in Europe, and volunteerism that emerged out of that. But also just the scale of it and the scope of it is really significant. And like you said, in the private sector, a lot of the decisions that have been made by multinational companies and US-based companies as well, and others in Europe that have something of a major investment in Russia, is that they made those decisions to pull out themselves. It wasn't because they were pushed because of sanctions, because there hasn't been large-scale sectoral sanctions imposed. It's basically them looking at this and deciding that they don't want to be in Russia at this moment, not just because of fueling the war effort, but that just the whole trajectory of Russia now has gone in a direction that they weren't anticipating. So I spent previous week up in New York talking to senior people in some of the Fortune 50 countries. And what really struck me was, irrespective of sanctions, a lot of them are not going to go back to the Russian economy. And that leads into that part of your question about how to handle this moving forward. It creates even more difficulty, because part of the art of negotiation, if we are to ever reach some kind of settlement, would involve incentives. And at some point, irrespective of whether Putin's still in place or Russia down the line, kind of, if in return for certain things happening, a lifting of sanctions, a lot of these sanctions are self-sanctions, and people are not going to return. And even in the energy sector, which of course has been the focus, although we know we haven't got an oil embargo or gas embargo at this particular point, and Russia's still selling a lot of oil and gas on the global market, the shift in Europe is now underway. It's accelerated to move away from Russian oil and gas. And once that shift has moved, we're not going to see that go back again. We're not going to see all those German companies and other European companies. Maybe the Hungarians will cling on, but others are really not going to return to the Russian energy market either. I mean, I think some of the food companies or those that are not so politically sensitive will probably go back because Russia remains a major market. But then when? Because again, I don't see this war ending anytime soon, and certainly not with anything satisfactory. And I do want to kind of warn people that we should be very careful about wishful thinking about Putin. Because, I mean, there's a lot of speculation. Is he ill? If he is ill, he's more likely to double down and to be thinking about his legacy and, coming even harder now, and particularly if he wants to see his version of history put in place before his history himself. And the other thing as well is we've got a very bad track record of regime change, talking about it rhetorically. Bashar al-Assad in Syria back in 2012, everyone said Assad must go, he's still there. I mean, thinking about Cuba and the Castros, or Chavez and then Maduro in Venezuela, and I mean, we can go on. Usually it's much best left for the countries themselves, and there's no sign right now, but there could be, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about that, but there's no sign right now that there would be any move against Putin. And in fact, we see, on the contrary, for the moment, a much higher levels of support because people are rallying around the flag. And Putin remains, for many people, the symbol of the state. And so I think we should be very cautious in how we talk about this and setting our own expectations of where this might end.
Very interesting. Before I open it up, I want to ask you one last question, which is, we have a lot of students in the audience, and probably a lot of them look at you and say, I would love to be Fiona Hill. Do you have any advice for students who are interested in a career in diplomacy or foreign affairs or national security? How should they prepare?
Well, I have to say that I've been incredibly lucky that I'm actually still using my degree. Which is kind of remarkable. So I just want to, a lot of people that I know, did move on to do other things, although I can see actually my classmate from grad school, Sandeep Baliga there, who actually did a PhD in economics. I think you're still using yours as well, right? So, but it is more unusual, sort of, right? Adaptation. But it's more unusual, if you're doing history and Russian, to be able to, still make a career out of it. Although some of us, clearly do. But I think the thing that I've learned is just sort of think about, your career in a big arc. I mean, I'm 56, and so it's taken me a while to get here. And, you can read out all these things on the resume, but it's not linear. And, lots of things took all kinds of twists and turns. And, I never expected I'd end up, where I am, but I kept on trying to broaden my horizons and, learn as much as I possibly could about a broader range of issues. I mean, not straying too far away from what I knew, but looking for any opportunity to work with people that I could learn from. I mean, you mentioned, the introduction mentioned a book that I co-authored with a colleague at Brookings, Mr. Putin Operative in the Kremlin. And my co-author was Clifford Gaddy. And he's still alive. I said was, he's still with us, but he's retired now. He's also an economist. And Cliff's 20 years older than me and knew just so much more than I could possibly know about the Soviet economy. He looked at the defense industry and, he'd been working for years in this space, whereas he wasn't a historian, although he spoke extraordinarily good Russian and, other languages as well. There was all kinds of things that I had to bring to the table that he didn't have. And I would just say to people, seek out opportunities like that to work very closely with someone else you can learn from, or in teams that you can learn from. Because every time that I've done that, it's opened another door. And any kind of opportunities to try something new.
That's so interesting. And it's fun too, right?
It is, yeah. Sometimes not so much. Some things have not been so much fun, but those things.
Okay, we have time for a few questions. So please raise your hand if you have a question, and the mic will come to you, and I'd appreciate you identifying yourself.
Yeah, and I know I've covered a lot of different things here, but I'm any question that anybody wants to ask. I mean, I'm just more interested in, what you would like to know about.
So, yes.
So I have a question about Trump 2024. Would the relationship with Putin be different than it was during Trump's administration previously? And how might it be different? How might it be the same?
Well, look, it's a great question because there's another, as I said in the overview discussion, 2024, Putin also has to get re-elected. Now, it's hard to kind of see how that's going to play out at this particular point. Elections actually matter in the Russian system. And they matter for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, it's kind of constitutional. And actually, Putin, although he looks more like a modern day Tsar, is a constitutional monarch in many respects, if that's the case, just without a lot of checks and balances. And his legitimacy is based on the constitutional need for an election. But he's not a member of a party. And so it's just kind of him. So every election is really all about him. And so the second reason why it matters is precisely because of that he has to be legitimately popular. And one of the reasons that we saw the annexation of Crimea back in 2014 was that Putin had come back into the presidency after stepping aside for a short period and having Dmitry Medvedev act as president when he was prime minister. And there'd been all these protests at his return. And there was kind of a feeling around him that his brand was stale and that he wasn't as popular as he had been. And the act of annexation of Crimea shot his approval ratings through the charts, 88, 90%, because Crimea was seen as the territory that got away. I mean, pretty much everybody universally, even if they opposed Putin, was supportive of the annexation, or they would say the reincorporation of Crimea. This war looks on the surface popular, but it's not really. Some people would say when pollsters are asking someone, so do you support this special operation? It's like someone, are you ready to be arrested if you give the wrong answer? So, there's a bit of a high bar to saying no. And then there's also because Putin himself is the symbol of the state. And it's kind of, like in the UK, if you ask what you think about the Queen, unless you're an ardent Republican in the British context, you're going to say something positive because she's so intertwined. And as brutal and ruthless as Putin appears to us from the outside, after 22 years, people see him as the symbol of the state, and he's become the kind of embodiment. And he himself has worked very hard at creating that kind of image. But nonetheless, there's a lot of tensions arising because of the war. A lot of people being killed, although most of the casualties are not in Moscow and St. Petersburg. I mean, one notable thing here is that most of the soldiers who are being sent to the front come from outside of the big cities. Very deliberate, because that's where his popularity is the lowest. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Russians leaving and going somewhere else who don't support the war. And a lot of tension rising up in the intelligence services because they knew outside of the domestic intelligence, the FSB, who helped plot this war along with Putin, that this was going to be very difficult, a bit of a disaster. Lots of discontent among Russian generals who were getting killed at the front. So, his popularity in elite circles isn't what it used to be either, and those count a lot. And if people think that his popularity is soft and that it's just superficial, that it's actually going to be quite difficult for him to basically maintain this image of being the all-powerful, the strong man within his system. And if he's sick on top of this, if he really is, that all of that weakness leads to the question about what will happen in 2024. So will he declare martial law? And, basically, will he still be with us in 2024? So that's kind of part of the other part of your question. Now, Trump was always obsessed with Putin because Putin was the strong, powerful, populist president. And obviously, Putin became part of our domestic politics because of the interference in the 2016 election. And, right now, I don't think the Russians will be in, quite the same mindset about interfering. They've got a lot of problems on their own hands. And it would be very interesting to see, how that would play out in 2024 with Trump back in. Now, one thing is that in Europe, Trump will not be seen as legitimate, just to be very clear. And especially if it's another win in the Electoral College by a very small amount, our whole system will be looking like a real problem. Because, how many times can you actually do that where millions of people become disenfranchised by the system? And that was actually Putin's point with the interference in 2016 was to show the United States up as being full of hubris and not the gold standard of elections and not the great democracy that we said that we would be. And a return of Trump to 2020 in power to 2024 would just be the nail in the coffin. And so maybe Putin might be less interested in courting Trump in the way that he was before as well. But what Putin is clearly hoping for is probably a return to this if he's still there himself, because it'll be from his point of view, the disintegration of the coalition and of the unity that's arrayed against him in support of Ukraine. Because of course, Trump made it very clear, I mean, that's how I had my strange starring role in the impeachment, that he saw Ukraine as something that was more about his own private interests than it was about national security and foreign policy. So Putin's obviously watching our politics pretty closely, but I would say that at this particular juncture, given all the troubles that Putin himself has, that 2024 is not just a long way away, but there's many complexities and many different directions that things could take on the way there. I mean, I have myself the same sets of questions, and I have no idea. This is a tea bag rather than tea leaves, but I don't even know how I would, start to think about what's going to happen in 2024 from this vantage point right now.
Great. So we have a question from one of our virtual participants. Evolution towards increased military alliances, even though they are understandable, reminds me of the lead up to World War I. How do you think today's expansion of NATO poses, or do you think today's expansion of NATO poses a similar risk to wide-scale military conflict, or are there factors that lead you to believe that this comparison is no longer valid in the 21st century?
Well, I think that these comparisons are important so that we head them off. So I think just by even raising these kinds of questions and inspecting them and thinking about, well, how did we end up into these kinds of mobilizations or slipping and sliding into war, World War I and, the dynamics that led into World War II. I mean, the importance of looking at that is to try to make sure it doesn't happen again. And I think there is a lot of debate right now about the risks of much of our assistance to Ukraine. If it is, conducted in a formal way through NATO. And I just want to explain that a little bit further, because Putin wants to depict this war as a proxy war. I mean, the fact is getting asked this question all the time, is it a proxy war? Well, Putin wants it to be a proxy war because he wants to continue to have the sympathy of the rest of the world outside of NATO, the European Union and the West, Australia, Japan, South Korea, who realize what's going on here. Because there's an awful lot of other countries, and we can name a lot of them, including China, that do see this as kind of Russia being basically in conflict with the West, because China knows that was what would happen for China with Taiwan, for example, but also because during the Cold War, the Soviet Union presented itself as the leader of the non-aligned movement and also the leader of the kind of liberationist movement, the kind of Marxist liberationist movements in places like Africa that emerged at the end of the British Empire and the kind of colonial period. Now, the Soviet Union was a kind of a strange place that did bring some of those elements together, but Putin's Russia is an imperial power, at least an aspirational imperial power again. And this, grab of Ukraine would be very similar to the United Kingdom trying to take Ireland back again, for example, over a dispute over Northern Ireland. There's lots of structural similarities there, actually. Donbass and, kind of Northern Ireland are not that dissimilar in terms of being these, complex old industrial areas built up, during the height of heavy industry with lots of different people coming in to settle there. Or if the United States invaded Canada because they're English speaking and we're sick of that flirtation with the French. I mean, it's that absurd because that's basically what Putin is saying about Ukraine. And every country globally has a period of independence or of changing borders, shifts in its territory. So, I mean, again, this is extremely problematic, but it's exactly the trap that Putin wants us to fall into, which is to have this kind of declared a war. And he said it. I mean, he said this on May 9th in his Victory Day speech. He said it in all of his pronouncements. This is now Russia against the West, and that this is not about Ukraine, that Ukraine is the battlefield, just like Vietnam was or Korea was during the Cold War. And we have to resist that. I know that we all, want to see Ukraine succeed here. And of course we do, but we have to be very mindful of how this is getting framed and the dangers of this, because then Ukraine will not get support. And Russia will, continue to find ways around every effort that we have to do to constrain its ability, to basically wipe Ukraine off the map.
A mic over here. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Hill. I'm Peter Miller. I'm emeritus faculty here. I'm working with some colleagues in the Republic of Georgia on a civil society project. I wondered if you have any thoughts about whether Ukraine will focus Putin's attention on developments in places like Georgia, or distract him, or make no difference.
Well, I think it's certainly distracted him for the moment. And again, I think how things play out in Ukraine will be very important for countries like Georgia, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and, Kyrgyzstan, many others. I think right now, however, and thinking about Georgia, again, Ambassador Kelly was also our ambassador to Georgia, at one point as well. So, kind of maybe you can catch him if you don't already know him in the audience on the way out. Putin is quite happy about the way things have gone in Georgia. Georgia's been quite marginalized over the last several years in terms of, international thinking. Back in 2008, we were all Georgians. And then, Russia invaded Georgia. That war ended pretty quickly after the intervention of President Sarkozy of France. And, what became a very flawed, it wasn't really a peace, but more of a truce than anything else. But Putin's nemesis from that time, Mikhail Saakashvili, is now in a Georgian prison, although I think he got moved to a hospital recently. And this has played right into Putin and Russia's hands, because there's all kinds of political infighting in Georgia now, in which, because of Saakashvili and the complexities of him as a person and things that he's done, including getting Ukrainian citizenship and being in Ukraine and Georgia and back and forth all over the place, and his relationship with Zelensky, that the Georgians are pulling themselves away from support for Zelensky, even though they're kind of sort of supporting Ukraine. And for Putin, playing into all of these divisions that are going on in terms of other countries' politics is exactly, the goal, so that they're not able to, rally against him or create any kind of solidarity. Now, there's been a really interesting moment just in the last couple of days. There's a meeting of the Common Security, Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO, which is kind of Putin's sort of poor man's version of NATO, which includes Belarus and Armenia and Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. And the president of Belarus, which is now pretty much completely taken over by the Russians and used as a platform for the war in Ukraine, has been remonstrating with the other leaders who are notably silent about their lack of support for Putin and Russia in Ukraine. And of course, they're not supportive of this. They're terrified because they're thinking that now he's distracted. But, if Russia succeeds in reducing Ukraine to rubble and, kind of basically annexing more portions of it and, kind of basically pulling everyone to a standstill, that he will turn his attentions back to them again. And even if the Russian military is weakened in terms of its ability to take on a major, kind of, let's just say, a relatively significant military like Ukraine, all of those other countries are incredibly weak and very much dependent on Russia for their security, including places like Armenia that have, Russian military bases, for example. So absolutely, your point is really well taken. And actually all of those three things, are kind of possible, distracted for the moment, but, probably returning attention later on.
So we have a question online. If Russia were to lose control of Crimea, would that, in the Russian conception, be considered the kind of existential threat that would justify the uses of weapons of mass destruction?
I think Putin's playing it up like that. Again, like I said at the very beginning, which I know is a little hard to grasp, Putin's fighting for his version of history. And in his version of history, Crimea plays a central role. And if you want to go back and look at the speech that he gave in March of 2014, in another incredible hall with all kind of like decked out, modern czar giving a big speech at the acquisition of territory or the reacquisition of territory again, it becomes very evident that the whole mythology of modern Russia, his Russia, Putin's Russia, is linked to Crimea. I mean, Putin is also, in a way, this is again, let me try to kind of put this so that it becomes clear. So Putin's namesake, Vladimir, he's Vladimir Vladimirovich, was Saint Vladimir or the Grand Prince Vladimir of Kiev. Putin's dropped the Kiev bit. And Grand Prince Vladimir was, in history, and again, a lot of history is mythologized, because we're going back to 988 here. And having grown up in the UK, a lot of these chronicles that were, kind of first, kind of created in that kind of time frame, they're written with a certain version. They're the instrumentalization and, weaponization of history too. I mean, I grew up thinking the Vikings were terrible, because every, kind of monk, whose monastery had been sacked by the Vikings, had written a chronicle about these terrible raping and pillaging Vikings. And then I did Ancestry, DNA, and I discovered I'm 6% Viking. And so now I'm reassessing that view, right? I'm thinking, did, great-great-grandfather Olaf really, rape and pillage? I'm not sure. If I am a Viking too, maybe I need to rethink that. And that's, I just, putting this in a silly fashion, that's kind of what's going on here. Putin is basically trying to create a present and shape a future by going back into a past, a version of past. And as he's Vladimir Vladimirovich, he's kind of acquiring a certain version of Grand Prince Vladimir of Kiev, but now of Russia, all Rus of Russia. And they were actually a Viking dynasty, just to be clear as well. So the Vikings were everywhere at different points between the 10th and 11th centuries. And he's put a statue of Vladimir right in front of the Kremlin. Just as he kind of come out to the main gate in his car, he can see a Vladimir, and Vladimir can greet Vladimir. And Vladimir, the Grand Prince, is supposed to have been baptized in a place called Khersones on the peninsula of Crimea. Who really knows, right? Now, Zelensky is also Volodymyr, the Ukrainian version of the same name. And there is a statue of Grand Prince Volodymyr of Kiev, also in Kiev. And basically, Putin is rejecting the fact that Volodymyr Zelensky can somehow be the heir of Grand Prince Vladimir of Kiev as well. The Kiev is gone. And that Kiev itself can be something independent, because Kiev is only the basis for the emergence of Russia and, this kind of whole Russian history. So we've got a bit of a nightmare here, a nightmare scenario. And, Putin also, and again, this is also difficult to explain, but in the old Soviet passports, Jew was a nationality, Еврей. So Putin is basically saying that Volodymyr Zelensky cannot be Ukrainian because he's Jewish. Because when he was born, it was still the Soviet Union in his passport. He was listed as Еврей, not Ukrainians, not Ukrainian. So Putin is basically kind of saying here that people can't identify themselves how they want to as Ukrainians. Whereas Zelensky in Ukraine are basically saying we're a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional country with a very confusing, perhaps, but rich history. All kinds of empires have been and gone. And why can not Volodymyr Zelensky, a Russian-speaking Jew, be president of a modern Ukraine? And so Putin is basically fighting this out. And this is why we're in such a dilemma. If we all went back to that, at one point where I grew up in north of England was the furthest reach of the Roman Empire. I don't know if the Italians would like us back again. The Vikings, maybe, I go back to, I don't know, Denmark or Danelaw or Norway or Sweden. Basically that's where Putin is taking everybody back to. And so, we have to really figure out how we tackle that. And that, kind of, although it may be a strange answer to that question, it's kind of where we are right now. And it makes it very difficult for us to deal with it in a rational way, because Putin has, in many respects, from Putin's point of view, there's no objectivity in history. It's just, the version of history that you present. And so this is a battle for the past for him, but for Ukraine, it's a battle, and for Ukrainians, of all of the different backgrounds that they come from, it's a battle for their future.
Well, that's, I think, a great place to end. Fiona, you have given us such a wide-ranging perspective, everything from medieval history to present day geopolitics. And I just really want to thank you also for the inspiration that you are and the role model that you are to all of us, and for your service and for being with us today. So let's give her a big round of applause.
Thank you.